And what are you going to do with those birds? There was a Baptist minister years ago in Boston, Massachusetts, that out front of his church one day, he met a boy, who carried an old rusty cage and a few birds that fluttered nervously inside of them. And the pastor asked, "Son, what are you going to do with these birds?" The boy replied, "I trapped them out in the field." "So what are you going to do with them?" "I'm going to play with them for a while, and then I guess I'll just feed them to my old cat at home." And with that, the pastor offered to buy them. "Mister, you don't want them. They're just old wild birds. They don't sing very well." The pastor replied, "I'll give you $2 for the cage and the birds." "Okay, it's a deal, but you're making a bad bargain." The exchange was made. The boy went away happy with his new silver coins in his pocket, and the pastor walked around back of his church with the cage, opened the door of the small wire coop, and let the struggling creatures soar out into the blue. And the next Sunday, he took that old rusty cage to the pulpit and used it to illustrate his sermon about Christ's coming to seek and to save the lost, paying for them with his very own precious blood. That boy told me that the birds were not songsters, the pastor said, but when I released them and they winged their way heavenward, it seemed they were singing, "Redeemed, redeemed, redeemed." And so as we gather on this first Sunday of Lent, we are like the birds in the old rusty cage, and the door is open. Are we going to stay in the cage, or are we going to fly heavenward and recognize the redemption at hand? This season of Advent, I find that there's so much going on in preparation for Christmas that we kind of lose it. We're kind of like the birds caged in, struggling, and just doing 100 things. Besides the normal life and sports, we got to cook, we got to clean, we got to shop, we've got to, thank you for getting your shopping done early for this. This is wonderful. We got to decorate. But are we caged and stuck in there? Are we free and recognizing that our Advent speaks to us about being redeemed, about the first coming of Christ? And especially in these first 2 weeks of Advent, we celebrate and we prepare and we put our attention to the second coming of Christ. Are we ready to really receive Christ and to go home to be with Christ today at this very moment? Are we caged and the door's open and we haven't yet flown out? So I want to challenge us to look at that, and to look at that in our spirit of Advent. That our decorations, as we notice our church, minus all the gifts in the tree here and all the gifts that are stashed in the back, the simplicity, the purple, the Advent wreath. This past Friday afternoon, somebody stopped by my office and said, "Father, I got my house all decorated for Christmas." And I said, "Advent? What about Advent?" "Oh, yeah. Well, I guess I could go out and find 4 candles and make a little Advent wreath." Well, good. And so I challenge you, is Advent a part of your home environment? 4 simple candles, little green, little something, way of counting, of anticipating, of being free of all the stuff from Christmas, at least for a moment, to live that Advent of expectation, of the redemption at hand, of a love of Christ coming into the world, a Christ coming in the second coming, a Christ of mercy and of justice, calling us to be ready, calling us to that spirit also, as we heard in the reading of justice, to stand erect with our heads raised, ready to meet our God. There's a story that goes with this, mayor of New York during the Depression, LaGuardia, mayor of New York. And he was quite the character, as it was understood. He did things like ride in the fire truck. One day he took a whole orphanage of kids to a baseball game. When the city newspaper went on strike, he got on the radio on Sunday morning and read the funnies so that the children would hear them. And at any rate, on one bitter, cold winter's night in 1935, Mayor LaGuardia turned up at night court that served the poorest ward in the city. He dismissed the judge for the evening, and he took over the bench himself. He heard a few cases, and then a tattered old woman was brought before him, accused of stealing a loaf of bread. She told LaGuardia that her daughter's husband had deserted her, her daughter was sick, and her grandchildren were starving. But the shopkeeper from whom the bread was stolen insisted on pressing charges. My store's in a very bad neighborhood, Your Honor. She's got to be punished in order to teach other people a lesson. The mayor sighed. He turned to the old woman. I've got to punish you, he said. The law makes no exception. $10 or 10 days in jail. But even as he spoke that, Mayor LaGuardia was reaching into his pocket, pulled out a $10 bill. Here's the woman fine, he said to the foreman, and furthermore, I'm going to fine everyone in this court 50 cents for living in a city where a person has to steal bread so that our grandchildren can eat. Mr. Vailop, collect the fines and give them to the defendants. Following day, New York Times reported $47.50 was turned over to this bewildered old woman, and it was given by a red-faced store owner, some 70 petty criminals, people with traffic violation, and even the city policeman. And they all gave their mayor a standing ovation as they handed over their 50 cents. Folks, that's how it will be with God's world. Just when it seems that all hope is lost and goodness and mercy shall never win, the great judge will come to set things right, deciding for the hungry and the meek of the earth. Yes, there is also an Advent promise for the nations of the world in perplexity and distress, and it all comes together with that line, look up, raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. So on this first Sunday of Advent, we recognize our generosity, especially through this project of providing for others, but we also recognize again and again that perhaps we're trapped in that rusty old cage, and we need to move beyond that. And recognizing a justice and a merciful and a loving God who calls us to freedom, to truly be redeemed, and in that redemption, to ready our hearts and our minds and ourselves by living this Advent in expecting of Christmas. So take a moment. What do I really need to do to step away from the busyness of the world to be Advent for at least a moment right now?